Hello, my name is Matthijs Hoekstra. I'm a program manager in the Azure Identity Engineering organization. In this video, I want to talk about what our identity platform is, why you as a developer should care and why it's important, how it works, what we have as a toolbox for you as a developer to use in identity space, and also how you can get started with your first application. Since this is a developer presentation, let's start with a demonstration and show you some code. So let me show you this application. It's a JavaScript single-page application and it's going to call a protected API. I'm going to start this application 3 times to log in 3 different ways, and then I will show you a little bit of the code and explain you how it works. So first let me log in as Megan. And for Megan, I'm going to use a login and password. It's going to show me a welcome message. Hello, welcome Megan. And it shows me the results of the graph API call I just did. Sign out. For the second login, I'm going to use my Android phone I have here, and I have an Authenticator app installed. I have an application to mirror the screen on my computer. So when I now log in as Adam, instead of asking me for a password, it's going to ask me to tap 27 on my device, approve, use my finger, and sign me in, and call that same protected API and show me the result. So I now logged in as Adam without using a password. It was a passwordless login using the Authenticator application. And for the third one, I want to sign in with a FIDO2 key. I got a FIDO2 key here inserted in my USB hub. This is the one I'm going to use now to log in as well. So I'm going to select Adele. Instead of entering a password, I'm going to select a security key. I'm going to touch it with my thumb. I'm now logged in as Adele using passwordless FIDO2 login. The FIDO2 keys, I got a bunch of them here as well. There's different form factors. I got a YubiKey. The one I just used was from Phytion. There's others as well. The ones from Phytion have a fingerprint reader. That means I don't have to enter a PIN code. I can just use my thumb to make sure and to prove that's me. And what these keys actually do, they protect my account, in a sense, with hardware, so it's tamper-proof. So this gives me a way to, without a password, I can actually multi-factor authenticate myself into this application. So let me stop the application and show you a bit of the code. This is the API I want to call. There's some configuration here, which we're going to talk about later. I'm going to set up this application with the right configuration. And when I click sign in, I'm going to show a pop-up to ask for the account you want to use to log in. If that's successfully, I'm going to show this welcome message, welcome Megan. And then I'm going to ask for permission to call an API and call the API. So the show welcome message is here. It just shows me hello, welcome Megan. I'm going to ask for permissions to call the API and actually call the API if that's successfully. That's done here. It's just the REST API call. And the result is actually just showing you on the screen as an JSON blob. This is what the application does. That's it. There's no code to do MFA. There's no code to just log in password. And there's no code to do FIDO2 passwordless login. If you're using the Microsoft Identity Platform, that's all taken care of for you. So if you've been to any Microsoft presentation or event in the past, you might have heard us talk about digital transformation. This is literally what our customers are talking to with us about. So this is something we want to do. In the past, we built applications just for ourselves, a little line of business app, only internal use. Nobody else outside of the organization was actually interested or cared about that application. We didn't work with those folks. But nowadays, what the world is now changing is now we have to work with our partners. We have to work with distributors. We have to work with devices and things, suppliers. Folks from outside of our organization actually have to collaborate with us as well. So if you draw this picture a little bit different, we think that identity is actually in the middle of this entire world. It's the control plane, so to say. So by managing and controlling the identity, we can actually make all those scenarios work. To make it a bit of simpler as a picture, I like to draw it like this. So we care about users. We want to be able to use it to log in and reach out and actually be able to use our application. But we also have to protect and access resources. And of course, we always have to deal with our administrators, our biggest friends in the world, because they come up with all these kind of policies and want to decide who can do what and when. In the middle, identity actually is like the intersection of all those worlds. So let's just go through these ones all these ones one by one. So as a developer, obviously you want to reach as many developers as possible. If you're building an LOB app, you want to reach all your colleagues. If you want to work with all your partners, you want to reach all those folks as well. If you're an ISV, building a SaaS solution, for example, well, obviously you want to reach as many users as possible because they might all be paying customers. So if you look at what we as Microsoft do with our identity services, we protect a lot of different organizations. So it's not just storing identities, it's actually actively protecting those identities. So even if you store your own login name and maybe hashed password, you're not actively protecting identities, you're just storing them hopefully in the right way. We do more than just storing identities, we have to protect those. So we got 1.3 billion identities. A lot of those are Microsoft accounts, the personal accounts you use for your Xbox and your OneDrive. We do a lot of enterprise customers. We have a lot of 250 million Azure AD monthly active users. And a lot of organizations are using Azure Active Directory. And we do a lot of authentication authorization with our platform as well, 45 billion. That's like over 100,000 a second. When working with partners, we actually have a solution for that on our platform, and we call it B2B. You might be familiar with guest accounts. If you ever worked with SharePoint or Microsoft Teams and you invite people from outside your organization, this is the platform you actually are using. So how does it work? Say I'm a user in the organization Contoso, and I'm working on this document, but I want to work with a user outside of my organization at Fabricam. So I can invite that user inside my organization as a guest, so we can collaborate on this document together. So what happens if I actually do this? So my Fabricam user tries to access this content from Contoso. Contoso said, I don't know who you are. You better prove who you are and go back to your own organization, log in and tell me who you are. So we redirect you to the Fabricam sign-in, which is also Azure Active Directory. It does the authentication piece and do all the stuff your administrator actually has set up. Then you come back to Contoso, say, look, it's me. Contoso checks if everything checks out, the directory, and we validate all the information. We send you the right tokens, and we're going to talk about tokens later, and you'll be able to access the document. We also have a product called Azure Active Directory B2C. What the product actually does allow you to do is a lot of scenarios where people I want to have people bring their own identity. So they might have an Azure Active Directory or an MSA, but they typically have maybe a Twitter or a Facebook account. And we can actually build a system where people can bring that identity to be able to authenticate against your applications. Business and government IDs is a typical scenario which we support as well out of the box. So you can build your application APIs and have users use those identities. And we can actually combine those as well. So I got one account for Matthijs, but I am able to log in with my Gmail and my Facebook account as well to that single account. The next part I want to cover is resources. Most applications actually connect to some kind of resource, either your own or the ones we host. So Microsoft 365 platform is actually a really extensive platform where we have all those different applications, ways of integrating with our platform, and in the middle we got the Microsoft Graph API. Whenever I ask people, well, what do you think the Microsoft Graph API is? Well, I get various answers, but I like to call it just an API gateway. And the API gateway gives you access to all those different resources we as Microsoft have built, Microsoft 365. So we get access to people, we get access to your files, your mailbox in Exchange. It could be your files in SharePoint or OneDrive. We get a lot of information on our security platform as well. For example, risky sign-ins is an interesting one for some developers. We give you access to tasks, to-dos, events. So see the Graph API as the gateway with a single way to authenticate, with a single calling convention, so it's easy for a developer to learn. And from that place, we go to the different resources behind the Graph API and make sure you get your results back. So if you really dumb it down, it's just a simple REST API with a single way of authentication, and we give you back a bunch of JSON, OData form data. But it gives you actually a lot of information and power as a developer to access your or your customers' resources. And it also brings a lot of responsibility. In another video, we're going to actually cover how the permission and security framework around the Microsoft Graph works as well. But to get access to your resources or your customers' resources, Microsoft Graph API is a strategic investment for Microsoft. Every new API we're designing and building, we want people to be able to access to the Microsoft Graph. And lastly, we have the policies. So this is where the administrators figure out what they like and what not, what applications can access what data, etc., etc. So if we go look at our crown jewel of our identity platform, it's called conditional access. What does that mean? So on the left side, we see for all the different accounts you can use to log into the system. We know if you're using an Azure AD account or an MSA or even a Google ID. We know if you're working from an Android, iOS or a Windows device. We know where you are. At the moment, I'm at work in a recording studio, but I could be in a public hotspot at a coffee shop as well. And we know if you're using a browser or a client application to access your data as well. So we capture all those different conditions. For example, I'm using my Microsoft device, which is compliant because I installed all the patches and my antivirus is up to date as well. Meanwhile, we as Microsoft, we capture a ton of data worldwide about what's normal behavior. We know where the bad actors are, what they try to do. We know where people log into the Xbox, where they are working on work-related stuff, or they log into the personal mail or work on documents. So we using all those signals to figure out with machine learning what's normal behavior and what's atypical behavior. And during your login, we actually do a real-time session risk. What an administrator can do, they can figure out policies, and together with the session risk, we actually have an effective policy, and that actually controls what's going to happen. So for example, I'm using my corporate machine to access this confidential financial information. That's all good. If I'm doing that from an Android phone in a public hotspot coffee shop location, they might ask me to do a multi-factor authentication. If we found out that your password was breached in another attack somewhere else, we can actually force you to reset your password as well. And we can actually block legacy authentication, which everybody should do as well. And an administrator can actually configure those policies, what's allowed when and how, by using this application, accessing the cloud or your SaaS solutions or your on-premises apps even. So why should you care for all this stuff as a developer? Because your administrators and your boss love this stuff, and this actually sells really, really well. Well, they're going to ask you to play nicely in this world. They want you to support all those different scenarios. So instead of you building all that functionality yourself, if you implement your application and integrate with our identity platform, this is all given for free. That's why I think this is important to understand. Your administrator is going to talk about this stuff with you and make sure you play nicely in this world as a developer. So why else do we need your help? Well, every time my mom asks, what do you actually do with Microsoft? I say, well, yeah, I guess I work on logins. This is the screen we typically show to developers, or to users. And our goal as an identity organization is to only show you this prompt once if you have to reset your password, if you're still using passwords, never again. So we can't do that by ourselves. We need your help as a developer to make sure all your applications integrate and play nicely in this world as well. So we will never, as a user, see this screen again. Why is this important? And we call this single sign-on. Why is this important? every time you show a user a pop-up and they have to enter their login and password, what you train them to do is enter a login and password in a pop-up. So if this happens too often, they will enter the login and password in any pop-up. They don't even care what the pop-up is, they don't pay attention, they're gonna just enter the login and password. So even bad actors, it's easy for them to try to get the password and the login name from your users. So no pop-ups about login and passwords ever again is actually a really good thing, and it's a security feature as well. But even after they logged in, seeing an empty My Application page, that doesn't make sense either. There's no value in that. So your applications need to be shown on this screen for your users so they can actually do their jobs. And we asked you to do it. You're not the first one who's going to do it. We at the moment have 2 million active applications. These are like applications somebody else built beside Microsoft. I think we got a couple of hundred in total. And on the right, you can actually see which ones are the most popular and most used ones with AD integration. So you might see a few familiar applications here as well. So now you understand why, as a developer, you should care about this platform. And I know security is always a bit tricky. I always make this silly joke about security for developers is like spinach. You know it's healthy for you, but most people don't really like it. Same is with security. Most people don't really care for it. They just know that it's important and they have to do it. So let me get you through the steps you as a developer have to do to make all these things work. First of all, you have to trust an identity platform. So let's assume you trust our identity platform. Then you have to think about, how do my users actually get this app? What can the app do, or what can it do for the users? And what resources does it actually need access to? And when do you want to ask users for that permission? First of all, every app has to be registered with Azure Active Directory. That's just how the modern authentication world works. We have to know about the application. And when you register this application, you give it a name, you give it a logo, some publisher information. There's things like reply URIs and secrets, and we're going to talk about what it means later. And you have like one application registration per application. And in Azure Identity world, in Azure Active Directory world, we call it an application object. So I'm now going to teach you a few of those specific terms we use in our platform. So let me just show you how an application registration is done. And we're going to come back to this page a few more times. So log into my portal as Megan, since she's an administrator. We're going to go to our favorite place, and let me zoom in a little bit. This is the home page of the Azure Active Directory blade. And we have to go to App Registrations. And if I have the permissions, I can actually create a new registration. Here I give my application a name, demo. I can choose if this application is available just for me or for other organizations as well. I will just leave the rest alone for now. I create my application and actually can change some display names, logos, and homepage URI, the terms of service and privacy statements. It's actually important because we're going to show this to users the first time they're going to use your app, and we're actually going to call it out if your application doesn't provide that information. And in a lot of countries, this is actually an important piece to fill in. On the left side, you can also see, okay, well, we can provide information about how to authenticate, how set up the security, etc. I will leave it for now. We're going to go back to it later once we understand how all these little pieces work and why they are there. So this is just the application registration for now. So now thinking about, okay, well, what users or which users actually need to use my application? So let's start with a scenario where you build an application just for your own organization. We call this a single tenant application. So the first choice you had to make when you did the registration application was actually making that decision. You can change it later, but it's the first question we ask. You can do it manually, like I just did, or you can actually do this through a script or automation, and you can provide the script to your administrator, or you can do it yourself. An administrator can actually decide who's allowed to create those application registrations. So applications and organizations can actually shut this down, so not anybody can just do it, and they can assign permissions to a few people. I've seen several scenarios when talking to customers. In certain scenarios, the developer, the administrator, and the security person actually have to sit together and figure this out. And sometimes like, no, yeah, the developers can do it themselves. At Microsoft, I can actually do it myself, which is nice, so I can just start building some applications without asking an administrator for permission. So this is the administration page, if you have questions, so where the administrator can actually deny users to be able to register an application. Just registering an application is not enough. Typically, an administrator wants to set up security in an application or actually grant certain permissions for the application as well. We do this with a so-called service principal. If you go back to our portal, you will see this under Enterprise Applications. If you've been working on Azure-related services, you might be familiar with the term, but the service principal is actually created inside of your Azure Active Directory tenant, and that's the object we can use to do user group assignments, set up permissions, set up the conditional access policies we talked about before, etc., etc. So the application, I like to explain it, is the application object is the class definition. The service principal is the instantiation of that class, if that makes sense. We can also make an application multi-tenant. That means that the application is available for people outside of your organization as well. Office 365, Teams, etc. are a multi-tenant application as well. So that's the second choice option you had when you register application. You can also allow people to log in with their personal accounts. The application is still registered in there, we call it the home tenant. So you get the application object there. If you use the application yourself, there will be a service principal in your own tenant as well. But what we do is people using the application in their own tenant, we create another service principal pointing back to that original application object. And this gives the administrators in all those tenants the opportunity to set up their own conditional access policy, for example. They can assign their own users, which they typically like to do. So think about the multi-tenant app as being one application registration, one application object with several service principals and all those tenants pointing back to that application object. And again, an administrator decides who is allowed to create that service principal or who is allowed to bring in that application in the tenant. So let me show you how that works. Okay, let's go back to our favorite Azure Portal Blade. We were in the app registrations before. Now let's go to Enterprise Applications. There's a bunch of applications here already. We're going to use in several other videos as well. I'm looking for Project Central. That one is not here in this list. So Project Central is a multi-tenant application integrated with Azure Active Directory built by our partner. So this should allow me to log in with my own AD account. And if I do that the first time, it should bring in that service principal in my own tenant. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to take a shortcut to one of my projects. It asks me to log in. And this dialog actually asks me for a few permissions, and we're going to talk in a different video about how this permission and consent framework works. But it's also the question of, is it okay to bring in this enterprise application in your tenant? Since I'm an administrator, I'm allowed to do that. We didn't allow this for regular users. They would get like an access denied or contact your administrator kind of message. Let's click on accept. I'm now logged into Project Central, and I can show you that by going to this screen. Look, I'm Megan, I'm logged in here, I got my profile here. So without asking me to create like another separate account, I could just use Project Central with my own account. Since I wasn't logged in, I had to enter my password again, but even Adam with his Authenticator app, or Adele with a FIDO2 key, that would work as well. And Project Central didn't have to write any single line of extra code to make that work. If I now go back to my enterprise applications and actually refresh that page, and if caching didn't take too long, which obviously it did, just let me search for Project Central, I can now see that Project Central actually is created. This is the service principal. And when I click on this application, I can now set up conditional access policies, I can assign users to this application, etc. So this is actually the service principal for the administrator to use to do all this configuration we just talked about. Instead of just asking users to go to URL and log in themselves, what you also can do as an administrator is add applications. So we have an application catalog, and we'd love to see your applications listed in this catalog as well. You can search for the application you want to configure, and by clicking on an application, we set up the application, you can assign users, etc., etc. You can grant permissions, so your users once start using this application, they get single sign-on experience, and they don't have to go to see any of those dialogues as well. So what is the Microsoft Identity Platform all up for a developer as well? So in the past we talked about Azure AD for developers, but I already talked about Azure AD B2C. We also support Microsoft accounts. So the Microsoft Identity Platform is actually more than just Azure Active Directory. This is a picture I like to show, high-level architecture. We care about the stuff on the right side. If you have familiarity with our platform, you might have heard about ADAL, the old SDK. We got a V1 endpoint, if that still makes sense. That library actually was used to code against that endpoint. But what we have today is the Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL. We have a single portal where you can register all your applications. We talk to a so-called V2 endpoint. That's actually the service, the service which we use to do the authentication, figure out if you have access, yes or no, etc., etc. And we support all those different identity platforms and the accounts with a single endpoint. We built a bunch of authentication libraries as well to help you as a developer to make it easy to integrate your applications with our platform. We got the making sure you get access to our data with the Microsoft Graph. There's an SDK for that as well, and I highly recommend you to check that out and use that instead of just doing your own REST API calls, which you obviously can. MSAL is our authentication library, and we got a bunch of different ones with different languages built for our V2 endpoint, and make sure that you can reach any audience with your applications. And we built this SDKs by practicing our own security development lifecycle. If you already have an application built with ADAL, we support those two side by side. We share the single sign-on state of applications as well. So if you want to move your application from ADAL to MSAL, we don't force your users to log in again, which is kind of an annoying scenario if you upgrade, for example. Or you can choose between, maybe I leave this little part of my application with ADAL, I start building new stuff with MSAL, and maybe over time move over my existing application as well. So the engineering team actually did a lot of work to make sure those scenarios side by side work correctly. So what libraries actually do we have? Well, a really important one obviously is the JavaScript library, msal.javascript or .js. At the moment, it's built for single-page applications. It was released at Build last year. We have an Angular version in preview, .NET, UDP, we got a Java version and a Python version. They are just recently released. We update those libraries frequently as well, obviously for security issues if we find them, but also with new functionality. At this moment, we don't build new functionality in ADAL. All the new functionality was only added to MSAL. Obviously, we have to support ADAL and do security updates, but no new functionality is built. What I said, Angular is in preview. Things we are working on as well is to make sure we support different flows. We didn't talk about flows, but code flow Pixie is something people are asking for. We are working on a version which works on the server for Node developers as well. We support mobile, and the reason I call this out is there's 3 different ways to authenticate applications on a mobile device. You can embed a browser view, and you can make it, customize it, and make it, give it the look and feel exactly how you want, and it's part of your application. That scenario is great, and it's used a lot. What it doesn't give you is single sign-on between different applications. The reason being is once you have a session established with our identity platform, that session cookie is stored, but since you're using an embedded browser, it's only accessible by your own application. We cannot share that session state between different applications. How to solve that is use the default or the system browser. Most mobile applications are now switching to that model. What you see is, you see it pop up over your own app, which is a browser control. We ask you to log in. You typically on iOS, for example, you see go back to my application on the left top corner. The advantage of that is that that session established with the identity platform, which actually gives you single sign-on, can be shared between applications. And the third one is called broker support. A broker is a way to authenticate your applications. It's either done through the Authenticator app I showed you when I did the first demo with Adam logging in passwordless through the Authenticator app. It can also be done through the Intune portal on Android. And what this actually gives you is it passes along the device ID to our servers. When I talked about conditional access, where an administrator wants to set up, you can only access this application if your device is compliant. When we use the system browser, we don't know from what device that request actually comes from. We need a device ID because Intune, that's our mobile management environment, actually has an agent on the device which tells us that this device is compliant, is not jailbroken, etc. And they store the device ID with that state. So when you are doing authentication, we have to know, oh, wait a minute, this authentication request is coming from a device. We're going to look up this device is compliant, yes or no. And that way we can actually do conditional access also for mobile devices. That's why we also support brokers. If you're using MSAL as a library, it actually defaults to that mode if a broker is present. So you as a developer don't really have to worry about implementing it. You just have to make sure that you're aware of this requirement in your organization and you can support it like this. What I like about being in the identity world is that everything is based on standards. So we didn't really talk about the protocols modern authentication actually consists of, but it's going to be OAuth2, OIDC, XAML. Those are the most known ones. But we support all those standards, and not just support, we are actually active participants in those standard bodies to come up with new standards together with other big IDPs like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Since it's all standard-based, you don't need to use our libraries. We do recommend to use a library because doing protocol level work is actually hard and complicated. It's hard to do secure. And we take care of all that work with our libraries. So this concludes the video about our identity platform, why you as a developer should care and how you can integrate your applications with Azure Active Directory and make it more secure. I hope you enjoyed the video and see you next time.